So we now have seen how the economy will move to a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And it would be great if the economy stayed there, but it doesn't. That short-run macroeconomic equilibrium will change anytime either the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curves shift. And so now we have to talk about how will the economy adjust in the short run to a shift in either the aggregate demand or the aggregate supply curves. In this section, we'll talk about how the economy adjusts to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. And we'll look at what happens if aggregate demand increases, and also what happens if aggregate demand were to decrease. So let's start with an increase in aggregate demand. We'll draw our economy initially in a short-run equilibrium. So we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve labeled AD0, and our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And we are starting with the economy initially in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So we're at the price level PL0 and the output level represented by real GDP at real GDP subscript 0. And now there's an increase in aggregate demand. An increase in aggregate demand, of course, is represented by a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD1. What caused that increase in aggregate demand? Well, it can be a number of those factors that you've studied that cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Perhaps businesses have become more optimistic about the future. And because they're more optimistic about the future, they've increased their level of planned investment. Or perhaps you and other consumers have become more optimistic about the future, and so you've increased your consumer spending. Or the government perhaps has increased its spending on goods and services. But in any case, some factor has changed that leads to a change in the aggregate demand curve. It's caused it to shift to the right, an increase in aggregate demand. But because aggregate demand has increased, we're no longer in a short-run equilibrium. At that price level PL0, now we find that the aggregate production of businesses, still represented by our GDP subscript 0, is less than the aggregate quantity of goods and services that households, businesses, and government are wanting to purchase. And because household, businesses, and government want to purchase greater quantity of output than businesses are producing, there's an unintended decrease in inventories. Businesses are running out of stuff to sell. There's no longer goods on the shelf waiting to be sold. And as a result, there's upward pressure on prices. So the price level begins rising. And as that price level begins rising, we start moving towards our new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Because that increase in the price level has caused business profits to increase. Production costs for those businesses are typically fairly sticky. And so if I'm able to get a higher price, I have an incentive to increase production because of those higher profits. And because businesses have incentive to increase their production, we move along the aggregate supply curve. The higher price has hurt households, however. That higher price has reduced the purchasing power of their wealth, of the assets they might possess. And as a consequence of that reduced purchasing power, households will now begin to decrease their consumption. And so we're going to move to the left along the aggregate demand curve. But those movements along aggregate demand and aggregate supply move us towards our new equilibrium level, where the price level is at PL subscript 1, and the level of real gross domestic product is at our GDP subscript 1. The economy is automatically adjusted to its new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the aggregate demand curve, AD1, intersects the aggregate supply curve, represented by AS. Now, in this particular situation, we note that that price level is higher, as is the level of output. So when the economy is moving to this new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, it's going to result in higher prices. And this is the problem we know of as demand pull inflation. But at the same time, because we're moving to a new higher level of output, we also might see some reduction in unemployment. The economy might be moving to a slightly lower level of unemployment associated with this higher level of output. Now let's see what happens if aggregate demand were to decrease. So let's again start in a situation where we have the economy in a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD0. We have our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And the economy is in equilibrium at a price level PL0 and level of real GDP, RGDP subscript 0. And now there's a decrease in aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So it moves from its original position, represented by AD0, to a new position represented by AD1. This decrease in aggregate demand could have been caused by any one of those factors associated with a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Perhaps businesses have become pessimistic about the future and therefore they have decreased their planned investment. Or consumers have become pessimistic about their future and have decreased their level of consumption. Government might have increased taxes, and because of those higher taxes, households have less income available for spending. There's been a decrease in disposable income, and so consumption goes down. But for whatever reason, the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left, and the economy is no longer in its short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. At the price level PL0, we now see that the quantity of goods and services that households, businesses, and government want to purchase is less than the level of output that those businesses are producing. Businesses are producing the output level associated with real GDP subscript 0, and the various sectors of the economy want to purchase much less output. And because they want to purchase much less output, there's downward pressure on the general price level. So the general price level begins to fall. And as that price level falls, it's going to cause businesses to lose profits. Their profits will fall because their production costs don't change, yet they're getting a lower price for the goods and services that they've produced with those production costs. And because they have lower profits, businesses will decrease their production, moving along the aggregate supply curve. At the same time, those lower prices have increased household wealth. And because household wealth is increased in real terms, there's going to be an increase in consumption. So we'll move down and to the right along our aggregate demand curve. And the economy is automatically moving to a new equilibrium price level, PL1, associated with where the aggregate supply curves and aggregate demand curves intersect, but that's also at a lower level of real GDP. And so real GDP is decreased to RGDP subscript 1. Now in this situation, that lower level of real GDP is most likely associated with higher unemployment. Businesses have laid off workers as they've decreased production. And at the same time, that lower price level might be represented with some slight deflationary pressure as the general price level falls to a lower level. And as a result, the economy has moved to that new macroeconomic equilibrium, but now with higher unemployment. It's now time for you to see how to apply these shifts in aggregate demand to Econoland's economy.